This is starting out very broad, but we'll narrow into how the tools of discovery come into play here. So technology has made such an impact in psychology that an approach dedicated specifically to technology has been designed, known as cyber psychology, which isn't what we'll be talking about today, but it's very important to consider if you're interested in the topic. And then on to the next bullet point. Many medical facilities have been making a switch to electronic health records, or EHRs, making treatment transfer easier between practitioners. This is both for physical and mental health. And then lastly, we have biopsychology, which uses the various tools of discovery to analyze the brain. These tools are considered technology, and we will discuss these today. For the AP Psychology exam, you should know the 5 that we are talking about today. And then on to the next slide, we have a little bit more about technology and psychology. So starting off, data collection and statistical analysis is easier than ever with computers, and it really assists a ton with psychology-related research. After that, images are now applicable to certain concepts not previously visualized because of an inability to analyze these areas. The brain is very complex, and you can't see a lot of the things that are going on, and that was what was happening prior to technology, such as the ones today that we will be discussing. And lastly, technology has just helped to standardize psychology overall by quickly spreading ideas. And then on to the next slide. Overall, technology in psychology can be used for data collection, brain analysis, and checking the psychosocial impact, considering the social media approach. And now if you want to get into the 5 modern tools of discovery, we can do that.
All right, cool. Are you going to do this this slide about the invented by in the years?
Yeah, so starting out, we have the EEG, which is the short name for the electroencephalogram, which was invented by Hans Berger in the 1920s. After that, we have the PET scan. Oh, also important to note that these aren't in order based on year. But the PET, or positron emission tomography scan, was invented by 2 people, actually, Michael E. Phelps and Edward J. Hoffman in 1977. After that, we have the MRI, which is short for the magnetic resonance imaging, which was invented by Raymond Damadian in the early 1970s. Not to be confused with the fMRI, which stands for functional MRI, created by John Bellevue in the 1990s. And lastly, we have the CT scan, which is the computed tomography scan, also invented by 2 people similar to the PET, those 2 people being Godfrey Hounsfield and Alan Cormack in 1972. Now let's get into the specifics of each of these.
And for the purpose of the following slides, I just want to say that the CT scan is also referred to as the CAT scan. So in some of the later slides, I called it the CAT scan, but just know that the CT scan and the CAT scan are the same. All right, so the first tool we're going to discuss today is the electroencephalogram, which is the EEG. And what this does is that it measures the changes in the brain electrical activity. You see here in this image, there's like different probes on the scalp, and it shows like the electricity in the brain. And here's the EEG reading. So once again, you place the electrodes on the head to sort of pick up the electrical signals. And then it can also show if a person is asleep or awake. And so with using this, it helps to diagnose sleep disorders and seizure disorders. So that's how it'll be helpful. And then next we have the positron emission tomography, also known as the PET scan. And what the PET scan does is that it measures the levels of sugar glucose in the brain in order to illustrate where neural firing is taking place. So for example, there may be a highly concentrated glucose in one part of the area of the brain than another. And glucose, remember that glucose is the fuel of brain cells. And more glucose in a brain area means more activity. So you see here, like the markings of the glucose. Like in the first slide, it shows where something is firing. So if you see areas with a lot of glucose, that means those areas have a lot of activity in the brain, which can help psychologists see like how different things are fired by different parts of the brain, how different actions may be fired by in different parts of the brain, which is really helpful to see what parts of the brain control what and what parts of the brain do what, which is really helpful. And yeah, so like I said, it shows what brain areas are at work doing different tasks. Next, we have the MRI, also known as the magnetic resonance imaging. So what the magnetic resonance imaging does, it creates an image of the brain structure. So it uses powerful electromagnets and radio waves to get 3D pictures. And remember that these are just pictures, so it just really shows snapshots of the brain. That's really all that it can show. So it doesn't show as much information as some of the other types of tools. So a psychologist or someone else may just use this to get just a snapshot of what the brain looks like. Also, next we have the functional MRI, also known as the fMRI. And what the fMRI does is it measures brain activity and tracking changes in blood flow. So to remember the difference between fMRI and MRI, remember that the fMRI shows changes in blood flow. And it can also show brain's functions by highlighting where the blood is flowing in different parts of the brain. Like I have in this image here. This image just shows different parts of blood flow in the brain during memory tasks. So it shows that these areas may have something to do with memory because there's blood flow in these areas during memory tasks. So when a person performs a mental task, the area of the brain can be detected from the blood flow of one part of the brain to the other, like this image illustrates. All right, next we have the computed tomography, also known as a CT scan, or like I said earlier, also known as a CAT scan. So the CT scan. So what the CT scan is, it shows cross-sectional images of the brain. So therefore, it shows like a series of X-ray pictures taken from different angles in the brain, and it can assess the brain for tumors and other lesions. And like we saw with the, go back, like we saw with the MRI, it shows snapshots of the brain, and so does the CT. It also shows sort of snapshots, and not as far as action over time. Like what the fMRI showed blood flow, and the PET scan showed the glucose. This one also just shows snapshots. And does anyone have any questions so far? I see there's, oh.
It's a lot of information, but we'll be recapping it shortly if it's still not getting into.
Yeah, it's a lot of different tools because there's different tools needed for different sorts of purposes. So these are really helpful for psychologists and other sort of professionals to get the most precise and exact sort of information that they're looking for, which is why these tools were created. All right, cool. Next, I put the slide because some people get confused between the MRI and the CAT scan and the CT scan because of them both being able to show snapshots. So people are like, okay, so they both show snapshots at the brain in a period of time. They don't show any sort of flow of anything. So what is the real difference between the two? And on this slide, I have some really key important differences so you don't get confused between the MRI and the CAT scan because they're actually very different. All right, so the difference between the MRI and the CAT scan. The CAT scan uses X-rays to produce images, while the MRI uses magnetic resonance imaging, which is very powerful magnetic fields. So the CAT scan uses X-rays, which is basically a radiation, but the MRI just uses really, really, really strong magnets to create images of the brain. And the third thing is that, that's supposed to be a lowercase s, by the way, sorry. But the third thing is that MRIs provide more detailed information about inner organs. So they can really show the different types of soft tissues, which would be really helpful if a psychologist or any sort of other professional is looking for the soft tissues in the brain to sort of identify lesions or something else. So the MRIs, if you see MRI, remember that it can show soft tissue. That is another key difference. So a way to remember it is that CT scan, remember images, and for the MRI, remember soft tissue, because they're just a more detailed picture, the MRI. Any questions so far? If anyone, I know that may be a little complicated. I can reword it in a different way if you need me to. But yeah, that's just how I remember it, and that's the best way to remember the difference between the two.
if there's no questions, then let's move into a brief recap of what we've gone over so far. So the EEG, the electroencephalogram, kind of a mouthful. The method is function, and it shows the function by using electrical activity and like electric currents in the brain. Then the PET, the positron emission tomography scan, also checks function, but it uses the glucose levels in the brain. The more glucose, the higher the brain activity should be. Then the MRI is the magnetic resonance imaging, which is the first one so far that we've gone over that uses checks anatomy, and it does that by using electromagnets and radio waves. Then there's the fMRI, which checks the functions by analyzing blood flow and where the blood flow is going, the brain activity, etc. And then we have the CT scan, which is computed tomography scan, which is structure, same thing as anatomy, and it does that by using cross-sectional imaging. Now let's move into some multiple choice questions.
All right, so first practice question. A psychologist wants to see the blood flow of a brain to see where blood is flowing in the brain when an individual is performing speaking tasks. Which tool should they use? Should they use A, a PET scan, B, an MRI, C, an fMRI, D, a CAT scan, and E, an EEG? Now, in the question, look for some keywords that may help you answer this question. So remember the different tools, and then reread the question and see if anything sticks out to you that makes you think, okay, so it's that tool.
The keywords also... Oh, sorry.
Oh, you're fine. Go ahead.
The keywords also correspond to the previous slide, talking about the methodology. Think back to the brackets and what we had in there.
The answer is fMRI. Okay, so if you said fMRI, you were absolutely correct. And some keywords to lead you to that answer would be blood flow. Anytime you're really looking for blood flow, fMRI is most likely the answer. So that's just a big giveaway that we're talking about an fMRI if you want to see blood flow. And also this part where it says performing speaking tasks, remember that the MRI and the CT scan show snapshots. So if we want to see a flow or change of something, it have to be one of the other ones, like an fMRI, which will show the flow of blood. So, but just to see the word blood is a huge giveaway that we're talking about fMRI. Does that make sense to everyone? Yeah, that's just a huge keyword there.
The speaking tasks are also a relatively key word. It just narrows it down to function instead of anatomy.
Yes. All right, so now we go to the next question. So, which of the following, okay, this is question 2, by the way, and it's which of the following measures levels of the sugar glucose in the brain in order to illustrate where neural firing is taking place? Is it A, an MRI? Is it B, an EEG? Is it C, an fMRI? Or D, a CAT scan, also known as CT scan? Or is it E, a PET scan?
In this question, you might want to focus on sugar glucose and then neural firing. Those are two very important parts. Also to distinguish more function versus anatomy.
All right, so I'll go ahead and reveal the answer now. The correct answer is PET scan. So if you said PET scan, you were absolutely correct. If you go back to the slide, PET scan, it measures levels of sugar glucose in the brain. So seeing the word glucose is a very key word for answering the question, to know that it is the PET scan. Because remember that the PET scan shows glucose, and that more glucose in an area means more activity. So it's really important that you know that the key definition for the PET scan to help you answer that question.
Yep, and the next two questions are going to be getting a little longer. Instead of just being the names of the graphs, we're going to be going on to, or the methodologies. So for this question 3. So what's the difference between an MRI and an fMRI? It's a pretty common misconception. They're really close in name, and it's relatively easy to mix up. So it's either A, an MRI involves imaging of the brain structure, while an fMRI shows only neurotransmitter interactions. B, there is no difference besides the quality of imaging, like one is an updated version of the other. C, MRIs analyze brain structure, while fMRIs analyze brain activity via blood flow. D, an MRI is used by trained professionals, while an fMRI could be used by anyone. Or there's also E, which is they both measure glucose levels in the brain, but the fMRI can also assess if brain tumors are present. So the answer to this one is that MRIs analyze brain structure while fMRIs analyze brain activity via blood flow. So the answer would be C. And question 4 is just a relatively easy true or false question. Also about the fMRI and the MRI. It's very important to drill in the differences between these two. So the fMRI and the MRI were invented by the same person. True or false? So the answer to this one is false. This is a difficult question just because we didn't go over it that much, but the fMRI was made by John Bellevue in 1990, and the MRI was made in the early 1970s by Raymond Damadian. And on to question 5.
All right, so question 5 asks, what device records the brain's electrical activity with electrodes placed on the scalp? Remember an image earlier in the slides? I'll probably go back to it near the end so you can see what it looks like again. But just remember that image I showed you on that slide. So, and remember what device was correlated with that. So, was it A, PET scan, or B, MRI? Was it C, EEG, or D, fMRI, or lastly, was it E, the CAT scan or CT scan? So I'll give you a couple moments. Remember, electrical activity, electrode, scalp, all these words can sort of help you figure out what the answer may be. All right, okay. Well, if you said EEG, you are absolutely correct because, yes, that is the correct answer for this question because if you remember earlier, I'll go back to the image and show you what it looks like. If you forgot how it's set up, see, here's the EEG. It measures electrical activity by placing these different probes or different electrodes on the scalp to measure the electrical activity. So yes, that's why the answer is correct. If you forgot what the image looked like or you just didn't understand, that is why.
And if you've ever participated in a sleep study, you might have experienced some of those. Those are very popular in sleep studies due to the ability to screen for insomnia and other sleep disorders. And we have one last question for you, question 6.
Yes, I'm going to that slide now. All right, question 6. All right, so question 6 asks, show the brain soft tissue and, oh, sorry, this question, I think I worded it a little weird. It's meant to have a question mark at the end, but I think it's meant to ask, what device shows the brain's soft tissue and the structures of the brain? And is it A, MRI? Does the MRI show soft tissue and structures? Or B, does the fMRI show soft tissue and the structures of the brain? Is it the EEG that we just went over that shows the soft tissue and structures? Is it D, the PET scan? Or lastly, is it E, the CAT scan or CT scan? And remember, if you remember earlier, I made a whole slide about comparing 2 different types of devices. And I said, this is how you remember this device versus this device. And one of the major things I said is that one shows soft tissue and the other one is just a snapshot or a picture. Even though they're both pictures, one can show a little bit more detail of a picture than the other. So if you remember that slide, you should be able to get this answer correct. So I'll give you a couple moments to remember, and we can go back to that slide and see why the answer is correct. But just take a moment to think about what that answer may be. Oh, I think I already accidentally revealed it. Okay, cool.
Oh, what happened?
I think I accidentally already revealed it. Okay, but if you said MRI, that is absolutely correct, because I'll show you why. If I go back to that slide again. Okay, yeah, here it is. So if I go back to the slide here where I talked about the difference between the MRI and the CT scan, because and I said, and I had the last bullet, I had one major thing, and I said that MRIs provide more detailed information about the inner organs and can show soft tissues, unlike the CT scan. And if we go back to the question asks about soft tissues and what device can show soft tissues and structure. So we know that that answer must be MRI, because if you look at that last slide, it shows you that there's a difference. They both show images, but the MRI specifically is more detailed. So that is why that is the correct answer for this.
And that was the last multiple choice question we had for you guys, but we're going to be going into a recap just of the importance of what we're learning, what they're used for, etc. Just a few short bullet points on that.
Yeah, so did anyone have a question on any of those multiple choice? I mean, some of they're fairly straightforward, but if any of them were tricky or you didn't understand, or you want us to go over a specific device again, or you have a question about the function of a specific device or what a device can show and cannot show, just drop it down below in the chat, and we'll be here to help you out. So just let us know if you didn't understand any of the devices before we do the recap. But yeah, okay. So I don't think anybody has a specific question, so I guess we'll just go right ahead to the recap then.
Yeah, and also if you're watching the replay, then you can just ask us questions. Don't hesitate to reach out, because we're willing to help, even if it's not during a stream session. So now moving into the recap. So the first bullet point is that you need to know the 5 tools of discovery discussed on the previous slides for the AP exam. The weighting is relatively low for these, but it's still important to know, as there will likely at least be one question on these. So bullet point number 2. Both the EEG and the CAT and the CT scan are great diagnostic tools for abnormalities in the brain or some disordered brain activity. Now, bullet point 3. In a PET scan, higher glucose levels correlate to higher levels of brain activity. And then lastly, we have the differences between the fMRI and the MRI. They differ in terms of the measurement of brain activity. An MRI shows structure, while an fMRI measures brain functions using blood flow. This isn't all of the things that we've learned recapped, but it's a general idea of some of the important things to know, or things that students commonly make mistakes on.
Yeah, back to what. Oops, sorry. You say anything?
No, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. And back to what Emily said about the first bullet, it is very important that you know not only to be able to identify these 5 different tools, but also to know their purposes and how they could be implemented into different sort of experiments. Because missing a question about these tools, if you don't know them on the AP exam, that can be the difference between a 4 and a 5. So it is very, very important that you are familiar and know the functions and can identify the 5 different tools, because that can just be simple points on the exam. So if you know these, you're already a step ahead and prepared for the exam.
And frankly, it's also just an interesting topic, and it might help in real life to know the differences. A lot of people don't know what they should be going for if they have brain injuries or some condition that they need to have a scan for. They don't know what to go for, so it has great real-life applicability as well.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And depending on what you want your career to be, like if you're interested in medicine, it's kind of like a crossover. So now you sort of already know some different sort of tools that are used in the medical field and also used by psychologists in their different purposes, which is just interesting to know. So when you hear these words again or see them in any other places, you can be like, I know what that word means, and it just feels nice to know, you know what they mean, which is kind of cool. So yeah.